Simon Stock was born towards the middle of the second half of the 12th century. Long before his birth, the struggle between the civil and the ecclesiastical powers had begun. Although it seemed to have reached a climax in the reign of King John 1199 to 1216, nevertheless it continued intermittently during the 100 years of Simon's life. Nor did it end then. Throughout the Middle Ages, the strong antagonism on the part of the secular powers towards the claims of the ecclesiastics was everywhere apparent. There were never wanting defenders of the rights of the church, hence the struggle at times was fierce and prolonged. This deplorable contest could not be carried on in the nation without having its effects on the faith and morals of the people at large. The feudal system under which the people lived at the time had made it imperative that the poorer and dependent classes should participate, whether for good or ill, in the political and religious movements of their liege lords. When the whole nation was laid under interdict, as happened in the year 1208, the faithful, no matter how free from all culpability, were sure to feel the direful effects of the ecclesiastical ban. Local interdicts, of rather frequent occurrence, brought the selfsame inconveniences to all who came within the sphere of the ecclesiastical sentence. The scandalous and irreligious conduct of king and noble that called forth those spiritual penalties was ill example to the great body of the people. In addition to the deprivation of the ordinary spiritual helps for the people, there was a partisan animosity begotten in the minds of many by those recurring contests. It is quite true that the faithful had nothing to gain, nay, rather had much to lose, in the triumph of the secular powers. What was gained by king or noble was most likely to be squandered on warlike enterprises or lavished in selfish luxury. On the other hand, the church did not forget the poor, and the afflicted hospitals and asylums were opened and schools and colleges were erected, the expenses of which were defrayed from the revenues of its lands and houses. To fill the too often empty exchequer of the state, the king would keep episcopal sees vacant and benefices unfilled, so that their emoluments might become the property of the royal household. Ecclesiastics, who valued their sacred calling more than they did the kingly favor, resisted stoutly those abuses, hence the struggle was, as we have already remarked, both fierce and prolonged. Notwithstanding the disturbed state of affairs, the heart of the people remained true to the old faith during all those years. History may recount many great sins committed in the Middle Ages, but it must not, in justice to the people, omit to record the great penances that followed in atonement for them. The traveler in England can see undeniable evidences, lasting even to the present time, of the solid, aye, and even fervent, faith of the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. What a wonderful testimony for the religion of those ages there is in those old ruined monasteries, and those magnificent churches now crumbling to decay. Need we appeal to those seats of learning so venerable, and yet so efficient in our own times? If we would learn somewhat of the high water mark of the spirituality of those ages, we have only to turn to the untenanted hermitages built in so many out-of-the-way places, to the ancient oratories of the anchorites perched high upon the lofty hill, or on the mountain's brow, to the venerable yet fast-decaying reclusoria once inhabited by members of the devout female sex. Verily, it was not an idle title given to the England of ages, alas. Long fled the land, the dowry of Mary. During those 3 centuries were to be found in almost every part of England the habitations or cells of men and of women who had left all to follow on the narrow path the footsteps of the Son of God. In their attempts to get away as far as possible from the distractions of the world, they had recourse to ways and means that today excite our wonder whilst they demand our admiration. Were we not in possession of the facts, we should hesitate to believe that men and women in those ages could make such sacrifices for their spiritual ideals. Doubtless the idea uppermost in their minds was to get as near as possible to martyrdom without the actual shedding of blood. In other words, they were determined to gain the guerdon of what was then graphically called white martyrdom. To this end, they selected the most extraordinary places of abode. Sometimes a solitary would be found perched away up on a mountain peak, far away from the path of even the most curious traveler, sometimes deep down in a cave into which only the wild animal hitherto had dared to enter, sometimes caged, like the captive bird, in artificial cell over the swift-moving waters of a great river. Most, if not all, of those seemingly fantastic modes of living had been suggested by the reading of, or the hearing about. The lives of the early desert fathers who in their eastern cells had really made a science of how they could torment their bodies in choosing places wherein they might take the rest that nature demanded but which they in their spiritual enthusiasm despised. More intelligible to us of the present day were the abodes chosen by religious enthusiasts who wished to combine solitary life with a moderate charity to not a few of their fellow men. They built their cells in little oratories by the public highway, or near to the banks of rivers in the vicinity of fords used by the traveler. Thus it was that the pilgrim of life was helped in distress and succored in need, but never at the expense of the spiritual duties of those men of God. We find nothing to wonder at in the hermitages built close to the churches and indeed communicating with them by means of little windows looking on the altars. This mode of living is just a little removed, at least in idea, from the prevailing custom of the clergy having their habitations adjoining, and in conjunction with, the churches. At times we may wonder how a recluse could find his ideal of a solitary life in the confines of a churchyard situated in the very center of a populous neighborhood. Evidently in those years the difficulty so apparent to us now did not exist or perhaps was easily avoided. We may reasonably conclude that the Carmelite monks who came to England in the years that preceded the migration of the whole order to Europe were influenced in the selection of an abode in the country to which they had come by a twofold motive, namely, to follow insofar as possible the mode of life once lived on Carmel, and at the same time to adhere to the customs prevailing in their new home or place of exile. Before the time of St. Simon's generalship, there was not any other idea of religious life save that of the contemplative amongst the Carmelites. We see that plainly demonstrated in the selection of the first convents or monasteries by the monks who came with the Crusaders. They chose places far away from the busy routes of men and buried themselves in the silent woods, trying to find a second Carmel in the new land. Such, too, must have been the selections of the individual monks who preceded them. Secluded nooks on the mountainside, or on the summit of some wooded hill and cells woven from the leafy branches of the trees that grew in the retired sylvan glades were the temporary homes of those eastern visitors. Then, for greater security against the intercourse of men, they would bury themselves in the lofty human nests that overhung the rivières, for they had heard of, if they had not actually seen, the myriad monks who had found a resting place in the cavernous sides of the Jordan. Often where the banks rose highest and the water underneath ran swiftest. FTF, Amson Somasi Fortihibaliagar Hafizrams of Fesandant became a recluse at the early age of 12. Years we may justly conclude that he had not formed any idea of the manner in which a Carmelite should choose a cell for his solitary life. It is not, however, unlikely that he had already fixed notions of the eremitical life, and these may have been instilled into him by the teaching of one of those itinerant monks from the East. Most probably there was one or more of those lowly men who were living their own PCU liar life in the neighborhood of the home of the youthful and enthusiastic Simon. In this way he would be led on to the practice of a life to which he seemed to have been divinely called, aware of the fact that many chosen souls were living far away from the haunts of men and in places that were calculated to add penance and mortification to the solitary life. It was very natural that Simon in his youth and enthusiasm should seek for some method of living that might not be less penitential than any of those of which he had heard or perhaps may have seen. His selection of an aged and much decayed oak, the interior fibers of which had bled away under the devastating hand of time, supplied for him a dwelling place sufficiently solitary and likely to give him many opportunities of getting a practical knowledge of the much-desired white martyrdom. Trees, quite suitable for the purposes intended by the youthful Simon, were to be found in many parts of England. Certainly in the fertile southern countries there must in those ages have been very many, just as we see them today. The lengthy years to which the oak survives and its power of resisting the ravages of time make it liable to live on, whilst its trunk crumbles until only a circular bark-like coating keeps it from falling to the ground. In some countries the cavity thus formed is very spacious. In England one often finds room enough in the trunk of the oak to rest comfortably, and it may serve as a kind of tiny oratory or praying place. Nevertheless, life continued for a long period in such a cell must have been very irksome. Naturally, the open door-like space was always large enough to admit the winter cold and the summer's heat, with all the atmospheric inconveniences attendant on an English winter and an English summer. The choice of a tree trunk cell, however remarkable in one of such tender years, was not a thing hitherto unheard of indeed. It would be a rather difficult problem to find a mode of living, as long as it was penitential and very irksome, to which some hermit or recluse had not recourse in his desire for a retreat adequate to his preconceived idea of getting closer to God and farther from man to give the soul scope to expand and to thwart the appetites of the body. A retreat of this kind in one of the thick woody dales that then covered so much of the south of England was an ideal place to be alone with God. Remembering the reverence in which hermits and anchorites were held by the people in general, and particularly by the simple country folk who were most likely to be in the neighborhood of those places, Simon was quite safe from all worldly annoyances. The owners of places of retreat, in the years when Simon was a hermit in Kent, were far from displeased to have their property used by holy men desirous of dedicating their lives to God. The presence of one called to so exalted a state was a guarantee that the public would respect the neighborhood in which the servant of God lived. It is not unlikely that the place chosen by Saint Simon was in his own paternal property. Although thoroughly wedded to his sylvan retreat, there was no obstacle to Simon's paying a visit to his own family, or some special friends, or some neighboring hermit or recluse. The sincerity of the life was the best guarantee that any abuse in this way was not likely to occur, whereas, on the other hand, such visits were, at times, of obligation arising out of spiritual reasons. When the hermitage or the anchorage was too small to admit of the celebration of Holy Mass, then the servant of God had to make his way at the appointed times to the nearest church. We are also informed that from their rustic retreats went forth the hermit and the anchorite to preach the kingdom of heaven to the wayfarers, or mayhaps to denounce some special prevailing sin of the times. Coming forth from their intimate converse with God, the fruit of their preaching was, at times, truly wonderful, and in those places, wherein the diocesan clergy, and even the monks had failed to recall the erring children of the church to repentance, they had remarkable success. People of all conditions in life wended their way to the rustic cells of those men to ask counsel in difficulties and to solicit spiritual aid in distress. Their influence was extraordinary with the rich and the poor, with the sinner and the saint. There seems to be no doubt about the year of the birth of Saint Simon. All his reliable biographers are in agreement that he was born in the year of our Lord 1166. We do not find the same harmony in the discussion as to the family to which he belonged. Some biographers have given him rich and wealthy parents reputed to be of noble lineage. In fact, we read of the father of the saint being a count, or at least as one of the important nobles of the county in which Simon was born, hence the title sometimes written Count of Kent. Or as some prefer Count of Canterbury, others of his biographers mention merely that he belonged to honest and good parents whose piety was well known. The question is hardly worth discussing for the simple reason that it matters not who were the parents of the saint. Our whole interest is centered in him alone, and accepting the admonition of the Holy Scriptures, by their fruits ye shall know them. We may at once conclude that they were God-fearing people who were certainly noble in the eyes of their Creator, whatever may have been the rank to which they belonged. It might be interesting, even though not instructive, to recall that Simon at an early age was called by God to a life of self-renunciation and prayer. This would seem to indicate a certain amount of knowledge of the spiritual life not easily obtained in surroundings that were devoid of at least a mediocre learning and acquaintance with higher spirituality. We are, however, more impressed by the fact that so young in years he was allowed to go into a solitary hermitage and thus remain alone, far from all restraint and evidently without the recognized means of sustenance. One explanation at once occurs to us, namely, that he took up his solitary abode in his own paternal dominions where, although living a life of extraordinary piety and penance, he should still be under the eye of friends who could succor in time of need if such were to occur. This interpretation would make his manner of life in his tender years quite intelligible, and not so seemingly irreconcilable. In the choir of the old Carmelite church of Bordeaux, dating from the 13th century, there was a panel illustrating one event in the life of Bordeaux's great saint, namely, a miracle performed by Saint Simon when he was yet a recluse in his trunk cell in Kent. The scene of the miracle is laid in the paternal home of the family then in possession of the saint's brother. It is quite evident that Simon was able to visit his brother's household, and that his brother had still hopes of recalling him to what he conceived a saner life. The same miracle is mentioned in the office of the saint, not only in the oldest one we know of, but even in the one at present recited on every 16th of May. As we have to refer to this later on, we need not here delay to enlarge on its signification. Sometimes the name of a saint may give us an inkling as to his family, and not rarely there are titles or descriptive adjuncts to the Christian name that supply information as to place of birth or family connection. Although from the very earliest times Simon has added to his Christian name the epithet stock, we can only infer from this that his mode of life was living in the trunk of a tree. Just as we read of another Simon named Stylites, a title given because of his peculiar mode of living on the summit of lofty pillars. The earliest extant life of our saint is by John Grossi, who was general of one part of the order in the year 1389. This writer evidently copied his information from an old manuscript, which he had found on his visit to England, hence the title or epithet stock. Must have been known even in the lifetime of Saint Simon. It is utterly impossible that Grossi could have given that title to the saint, for he was a Frenchman, and the connection between the title stock and the mode of living would never have occurred to him. He was, then, simply relating a fact which he found in the older author, and like a conscientious historian, he gave what he had found there. A recent writer, unaware of the fact that Grossi had been in England, gives quite a romantic touch to his life of the saint, which we have characterized as the oldest extant. The lives of the saints do not profit by useless speculations. We must not omit to add that it was just at this particular time that family names were being supplied from occupations, or professions, or some peculiarity in the family or in the person. Nothing really definite is known about the parents of the saint. We have in some old manuscripts the mention of a brother who seems to have continued to live the same manner of life as his parents, and who was, according to some writers, occasionally visited by the saint even when he was yet sojourning in his trunk cell. From the external evidence, some of which we have already mentioned, we do not consider it at all probable that his family was so poor that Simon, in his earliest days, was forced to beg from door to door. Doubtless he did at times seek the charity of the poor, but it was from the same motive that urged saints like Francis of Assisi to perform the similar acts of humiliation. Consensus of opinion amongst their. Why? One biographer of Simon is that he retired to his solitary cell at the age of 12 years. No doubt some would favor the age of 15, but the exact year is not of vital importance. For we must see in the selection of such manner of life something more than the merely natural, even though his biographers were found silent on the point. They are not, however. All seem inclined to the opinion that one so young had need of supernatural help to venture on this kind of life, and to continue in the austerities of the rule he had proposed to himself. We must not suppose that Simon was a poor, ignorant country boy without education, having no real perception of the obligation incumbent on one who had taken upon himself the life of a solitary or recluse. Though we may concede that he belonged to the humbler class of the people, still we may feel quite certain that he knew well the nature of the life self-imposed. In those years, contrary to the prevalent ideas of later times, it was within the reach of even the children of the poor to obtain an education suitable to the wants of the age. The schools of the monks afforded ample opportunities to all who desired instruction, which was freely given without any idea of future recompense. One imbued with the ideas of the youthful Simon was not likely to omit an opportunity of gaining a means to realize more fully the promptings of his spiritual nature. We can, then, very easily accept the account of several of his biographers that, even at the early age when he went into his hermit cell, he was in posse scion of a certain grade of learning which doubtless he utilized in his new life, and which he was sure to augment in his solitary hours. His subsequent career is the best guarantee that he knew the value of learning. It would be all in vain for us to try and follow Simon through his hours of meditation and contemplation in his rustic home. If we could, it would be a certain indication that we too were gifted with the same spirit. Unfortunately, to us living in the world and surrounded by its cares and its troubles, it seems a mystery, although the fact is never doubted by the great body of the faithful that a soul, alone in the solitude of its cell, far removed from all human interests, can rest there with one only thought ever present to the mind, forgetful of all else, interested in that one thing alone. Not for hours alone does it thus remain, but for days and months and years. We may not doubt that the first years of Simon in his tree trunk cell were passed principally in contemplation and meditation. The very idea that moved him to his peculiar mode of life must have been the result of profound thought and serious and prolonged cogitation illuminated by a divine light. When, then, he found himself free from the trammels of domestic life, he at once betook himself to this science of the saints, wherein he learned the value of the things that pass in time and those that are in eternity. It is a study that never cloys in the soul of the true friend of God. Days pass and nights are as if they were not, to one engaged in this wonderful work of intimate conversing with the Creator of all things. Worldly joys are mere air bubbles, and earthly friendships are contemptible, when weighed in the balance with such spiritual delights and such ardent love. To the worldling, the life of those chosen souls, like Simon Stock, is totally incomprehensible. The scriptures well express the sentiment fairly common amongst men: we fools esteem their life madness, and their end without honor. When it is too late, the truth shall come home to us. Behold, how they are numbered amongst the children of God, and their lot is amongst the saints. So earnestly did the youthful Simon apply himself to this celestial science that he forgot the wants of the body, and were it not for a benign providence, his wasted frame should have sunk under the weight of his neglect. Once in the day, we are informed by his pious biographers, a little dog came trotting to his cell, bringing a scanty crust of bread. To quench his thirst, a little water sprang out from the hard earth. Heaven seemed to begrudge any of those precious moments to anything save to its own self. No wonder that the devoted children of such a spiritual father have read into those days visions and spiritual consolations which seem to the worldling not only improbable but ridiculous. Father Philip of the Visitation, a diseased friar, who has written very interestingly of the saint to whom he had a great devotion, tells us, without however mentioning his authority for the facts, that, at a very early age, Simon was wont to go in search of sanctuaries ankle shrines of the Blessed Virgin. If he found himself in any place where there was no memento of his heavenly queen, then he would procure a small effigy and erect it there, and if that were impossible, then he contented himself with writing the name of Mary on the trees in the neighborhood. His great love for the Mother of God had made him a poet, even at the early age of 7, and he was wont to break forth into sweetest numbers when speaking about his mother and queen. This we can readily believe. We have some few examples of his poetic labors belonging to his later life. According to the same good father, one of his constant themes was the Immaculate Conception of the Mother of God. A treatise on this dogma has been attributed to him. However, as it is not now extant, we cannot judge of its authenticity. That he made a vow of perpetual chastity long before he became a Carmelite is very easily believed. It was not by any means an unusual vow in those years. It is even more easy to believe that on the death of his mother he chose as a mother his heavenly queen. That in his cell in the woods we may expect to hear that he had frequent visions of his heavenly protectress, and that she could not deny him counsel when he was in doubt or difficulties, and moreover, that she came to cheer him in his lonely hours when his spirit was oppressed by the continued struggle and the prolonged penances. One of those visions is particularly interesting, for during it the Blessed Virgin revealed to him that in a few years should come to Angel on the members of a religious order, CSPECEC, dedicated to her service and devotion. At the same time he was informed that these men were yet in Mount Carmel, and that they bore the name of her brothers. It was likewise revealed to him that he would be a professed member of that order, whose full title was Brothers of Our Blessed Virgin Mary of Mount Carmel. Even after this vision, Simon continued his solitary life. Occasionally he went forth to instruct and preach to the people, for he was now of an age that gave him a certain prestige for the missionary labor. We are told that his efforts were crowned with success, and that men listened to him and obeyed his call to penance, because his burning words were the echo of a life for which they all had the greatest reverence. This account of his missionary work is in accord with facts we know of concerning other contemporary hermits and recluses. Amongst the Carmelites also it was the custom tom for their recluses to go out at times to preach to the people. This custom continued until the days of the Venerable Thomas Scope Bradley 1391 to 1491, who renounced the bishopric of Dromore to go into the hermit's cell, from which he occasionally went forth to instruct the faithful and to recall the sinner to repentance. Amongst the literary works attributed to Simon is a volume of homilies to the people. It was in all probability during those years that he reached and wrote them. From the time he became a Carmelite, his life was far too much occupied in the important and absorbing matters of the order to attend to literary work of his kind. If Simon had not met any of the exiled Carmelite monks from the Orient before his entrance into the eremitical life, he most assuredly came to know some of them in his peregrinations through the countryside when he went to preach and to Kate Chise. Recognizing that his ministry should be far more efficacious if he had the dignity and the authority of the priesthood, and believing that it would be accordingly advantageous to him in his future, as a Carmelite monk, to be in holy orders, he prepared himself for the priesthood, to which dignity he was raised by the Bishop of Win Tun, Peter des Roches, in his 40th year. Although deeply engaged in his studies and his missionary work, Simon never once forgot his interior life, to which he was profoundly attached and from which he drew the wonderful spiritual force that enabled him to overcome all difficulties and to prepare for the yet grander mission to which he had been specially called by his own beloved Queen and Mother. The whole life of Simon was replete with miracles according to his biographers, but they were always of a personal type and rarely had reference to anyone save himself. However, we read of one that deserved and received special notice. It must have occurred in the later years of the first missionary efforts of the saint, that is to say, before he had left his rustic cell to go on his pilgrimage to Carmel. As we have already intimated, this miracle forms the subject of an effective picture outlined on one of the wooden panels of the ancient choir in the convent wherein he died, namely Bordeaux. It was still in the choir when John Cheron was prior of the convent before the middle of the 17th century. Unfortunately, it did not resist the ravages of time, and so gave way to something more lasting, but less interesting to those who treasure all that brings us in touch with the earliest days of the devotion to the saint. It may have been that the event was too frivolous in the eyes of later generations to merit such a permanent reminder, at least in the estimation of some of the brethren. In every age, the faithful Christian believes that God can do all things, and the true Catholic knows that the real friends of God can, by His power, do many things that otherwise were impossible. Nevertheless, when it comes to an individual event of a miraculous nature, there is a tendency to let the merely human element be sole judge. Often events that have a deep significance and a practical lesson assume small proportions and shrink into the absurd or the ridiculous, when viewed only in the light of the merely natural. There is a common feature in the lives, whether of anchorite, hermit, or recluse, one which recalls a similar feature in the life of the older monks, namely, a great and abiding love for all God's creatures. When we read of Francis of Assisi leading the ferocious bear from its wilds to the great piazza of Gubbio, in order that a compact may be made between it and the citizens, both of which had much to forgive and forget, we do not want to question the improbability or the absurdity of the incident. We are content that it teaches a lesson suitable for every age of the world and for all peoples thereof. Another aspect of this creature love is displayed in the legend of Iona. Columba, the saintly abbot of the famous monastery, loved dearly not only all the brethren but also every creature that helped the brethren in their holy labors. An aged horse that had served the monastery for years, instinctively aware that its last day was at hand, sought out the holy abbot, and approaching him as he walked amidst his brethren in the fields, laid his shaggy head on Columba's shoulder whilst two great tears rolled from his eyes and fell on the habit of the abbot. The holy man, moved with a great love for the faithful servant of the monastery, uttered a few kindly words which seemed to satisfy the aged animal, that forthwith returned to its stable, wherein the brethren found it dead on the following morning. It is evident that the root of all this love of animals is the fact that God made them, and these are the creatures of His hand. During the later years of Simon's life as a recluse in his trunk cell, he was accustomed, as we have already said, to go a-visiting those whom he could help spiritually, and amongst them was his own brother. On such visits he never relaxed his severe manner of life, and his only food was of a vegetable kind, for not only had he relinquished all hesh meats, but he even would not allow himself the poor luxury of fish meat. On one of these occasions, his brother, who must have been well aware of his rigorous abstinence from all such foods, prepared for the repast to which Simon had been invited some very enticing cooked fish. Narrators do not agree as to the motive of this action on the part of his brother. Some say it was because he did not believe in the austere life of the solitary. Others that it was a temptation specially intended to try the strength of Simon's vocation. Others, some, more charitably, assert it was because his brother had no other food and wished to celebrate the advent of such an honored guest to the paternal homestead. Whatever may have been the motive, Simon was determined to teach them all a lesson. He took the dish containing the fish laid before him for his portion, went to the stream close by the door of the fraternal mansion, and murmuring a prayer, gently placed the cooked fish in the running waters. Lo! Before the eyes of the whole household, the fish came back to life and straightway began to swim in the waters. It is quite true that the occasion does not seem to merit such a special interposition of Providence, but of this we are not the judges. We must leave to the saint himself the right to declare the relationship between the event and the reason of it. The miracle is important to illustrate the nature of the austere life of Simon, since it is not at all improbable that he continued this restriction in food all through his religious life. If so, he must have led a life of great mortification, because the only food allowed to the early Carmelite monks was vegetable and fish. All kinds of flesh meat were prohibited until the rule was mitigated by the Pope. This gives us a slight insight into the character of Simon Stock. Doubtless this occurrence has made an impression on the early biographers of the saint, for the simple reason that being deprived of fish seemed to them a test of real mortification. Their first monastery in the south of England was built on the banks of the river Medway, and from the waters thereof the monks obtained their daily sustenance. It is evident why this event should be recalled by the pious writers amongst the Carmelites, and why it, above all the other extraordinary occurrences in the early life of Simon, should find a record and a lively memory. The same reason might account for the other strange legends told of him in reference to his tender love of fish life. We are informed that he could draw the fish from the Thames and place them once more in the water. They heark in to his voice and obeyed his call. It was a matter noted by all how docile became those denizens of the waters in the presence of the servant of God. One cannot refrain from recalling that incident in the life of the great wonder-worker, Saint Anthony. It is a pleasing and an instructive legend when he could not prevail on men and women to listen to his praises of God. He stood by the seashore and called the fish from their submarine haunts to hearken to his paean of praise, and lo, shoals of the finny creatures came alongside the water's limit, and arranging themselves in order of size, remained there until the saint had finished his sermon and imparted to them his blessing. We must confess that we hesitate to accept the further legend told of the blessed Simon, namely, that when the fathers were assembled for one of their provincial councils in the London monastery, and had nothing to eat, he went forth to the river Thames and, exercising over the fish that extraordinary power possessed by him, he drew forth with his own hands such numbers that the fathers had quite sufficient to make a meal for all in the convent. Just as the former story is in harmony with our idea of Simon, we believe this undue advantage over the fish for the purpose indicated is quite foreign to every trait in the character of the kindly solitary, even though fraternal charity seemed to be the motive. The biographers are not agreed on the length of time Simon spent, as a probationary period, in his cell the trunk of the tree. Some have accepted the number of years as 12, others at 15, the greater number, and we believe more correctly, have given 20 years as the time for his solitary life in Kent. It is not clear to us whether he, at the end of that probationary period, had met some of the emigrant monks who were coming to England at the time owing to the growing difficulties in living peacefully their religious life in the East, and from these learned all about Carmel, its history, and the life of the monks who lived thereon. Then, that recognizing the order foretold him, he had become a novice under the directions of those exiles, or whether he took the vow, as was the custom, to go to the holy places, and having arrived in Palestine, sought out the monks, and there, on Carmel itself, made his religious profession. We prefer to think that he went in pilgrimage to visit the holy places, and, having accomplished that desire so clear to every recluse and hermit, he presented himself to the superiors of the monks on Carmel, who in all probability had already heard of his life and of his sanctity, and so had no difficulty in admitting him to his period of probation antecedent to profession. In so far as we know, there was no place in England for the novitiate of Carmelite candidates. This would presuppose the presence of at least a small body of religious, and also opportunities of trying the vocation of those presenting themselves for admission into the ranks of the monks. No doubt in the year 1241, or about that period, there was a regularly formed community such as it was, but we are quite sure that long before that time Simon had taken his vows as a fully fledged Carmelite, otherwise his sudden elevation to power in the order should be inexplicable. It must have been soon after his ordination to the priesthood that he made his first journey to Palestine, that is to say, some time after his 40th year. The Venerable Thomas Bradley informs us that in the year 1212 Simon abandoned his rustic cell and made his profession in a recently arrived community from the east, that had then settled in Kent close by the place where stands the present ruined monastery, which of course was built many years afterwards. We mention this testimony because of the author who has written it, recognizing his worth as a Carmelite historian, even though it does not seem so probable to us. No doubt sufficiently large communities of the monks had already settled in other parts of Europe before, and about these years. All England was in a ferment at this time, for these were the years that preceded the king's having to concede to the people the famous Magna Charta. The presence of holy men who had great influence over the people was very necessary owing to the disturbed state of the realm and the dangers to religious discipline. Saint Berthold died on the 2nd of September in the year 1213, and to him succeeded, as general of the whole order, the blessed Alanus, who remained in that office until the chapter in which Simon Stock was chosen in his place. There seems to be no doubt that owing to the increased number of monks that had passed into Europe from the east, there arose the necessity of having a superior over the monks in the western parts with the same jurisdiction as Alanus held over all the order in both east and west. This office was allotted to Simon Stock, who evidently was well known to the various priors of the order in both parts. He was consequently a kind of assistant general, or rather commissary general of the order in Europe. The inference, then, that he spent quite a number of years in the East, and particularly on Carmel, is not only very natural but is a necessary deduction. During all those years on Carmel and in the East, there was a galaxy of men noted for their zeal in religion and for their learning as well as for their administrative powers. Nevertheless, the man chosen for government of the order in the West, and for the delicate embassies to popes and princes, is Simon Stock. This gives us some idea of the worth of the man and how profitably he must have spent his time in Die Tree Trunk cell in Kent, It makes the story of his years in the University of Cambridge more than a mere conjecture. Some of his admiring biographers have assured us he took not only his bachelor's degree, but that, on the insistence of the university authorities, he received his master's degree. The zeal afterward shown by Simon in the cause of the education of the youthful Carmelites reveals the mind of one who knew from personal experience the value of learning. We do not know how long Simon remained in the Holy Land on his first visit. We are inclined to think the time must have extended over several years. The life on Carmel was one very congenial to him, for it recalled the happy days in the tree cell in Kent. Once again, we are informed of the care Providence took of its favorite son. Simon remained in his cell on Carmel so persistently that he began to forget all the wants of his body, hence, as of old, a kindly Providence attended to his needs. The birds of the air, this time, were the good Samaritans who daily brought him his scanty allowance, just as in the days of Elias the ravens had succored the hidden prophet. His rare conversations were with men who were veritable giants in the spiritual life, men who had left all and crossed the seas to be in the shadow of a mount sacred to so many memories, men whose burning words recalled the prophet of fire. Rare indeed must needs be those conversations on silent Carmel, but golden every one of them. And then those hours of contemplation during which he saw the wondrous sights on which mortal eye never rests, and yet are plainer, clearer, and more acceptable to view than anything imagination ever pictured. There upon Carmel he renews his intimate converse with his heavenly queen. The threads of friendship first woven in the rustic cell of Kent are made firmer and rendered more beautiful by frequent visions, and often converse. Here it was that Simon stored up the mighty spiritual forces with which he was to conquer Europe for the brothers of the Blessed Mary of Mount Carmel. Viewed from a merely human standpoint, the mission of Simon was an impossible one, but standing in imagination at the door of his cell on Mount Carmel and visualizing the man and his surroundings, recalling his life and its motive power of inspiration and hope, the subsequent history of Simon and the order to which he belonged appears as an inevitable consequence. Certainly the workings of a benign providence may be easily noted. On his return to Europe, he at once set about the adjusting of his order to its new surroundings. We have no doubt that he was one of the effective instruments in obtaining the approbation of the rule from Honorius III. Even before the great body of the monks had left Carmel, there followed other papal enactments in favor of the order. These latter, 3 in number, related to the internal government of the growing order, and were granted by Gregory IX. We may not stop to recount the extraordinary occurrence that heralded the approbation from the Pope, although it has been recalled in the Annals of Carmel, and has found a memory in the Divine Office. We must, however, dissent from the more common opinion of the older writers amongst the Carmelites, namely, that the solemn commemoration of our Blessed Lady of Mount Carmel takes origin from that event. There is, however, more to be said in favor of its claim to the institution of the feast than the supposed occasion excogitated by Father Zimmermann. As a matter of fact, Simon had not only a part in the event which determined the institution of that important feast, but he was the leading human agency. The true origin of the feast shall find a place later in our narrative. Simon seems to have passed back and forth to the Holy Land several times. On one occasion he was the companion of the Blessed Jordan, general of the Dominic Ants, a worthy successor to the zealous Dominic, who, on his return journey, was shipwrecked and lost his life. So strong was the bond of friendship between them that Simon was able to console the brethren of the Blessed Jordan by confidently asserting that he was in bliss enjoying the vision of God. The holy man, a short time after his death, had appeared to him and told him of his eternal happiness, the reward of his life of piety, prayer, and zeal. Owing to the prestige that Simon had acquired in the principal countries of Europe, and because of his position as representative of the General of the Order in the West, his presence was necessary at the important General Chapter on Mount Carmel in the year 1237. In that chapter was decided the migration of the Fathers. At least as many as could make their way to the West had full permission to leave the sacred mount, and also the monasteries in eastern regions. It was no longer safe for the brethren to live their religious life in the Holy Land, because the persecution of the Saracens had become intolerable. From time to time they were forced to seek shelter and safety in the walled and guarded cities. Hence the regular observance of their religious exercises became impossible. Some of the brethren betook themselves to the island of Cyprus, the nearest place of safety to their beloved Carmel. Some continued their voyage to Sicily and Italy. Some, journeying still farther towards the western shores, sought places for erecting monasteries in their native lands. There they were more likely to find a welcome as well as more favorable opportunity to lay the foundation for future Carmels amongst those whom they knew. This exodus was a kind of foreshadowing of the things that were to come on Carmel in the east. It was a warning to prepare the monks for the evil day, not so very far distant, when fire and sword would sweep the glory from Carmel and the voices of the faithful brethren, who lived on until the very last in the sacred cradle land of their order, were hushed to silence by martyrdom. No wonder then that the chronicler tells us that during the chapter, whilst the fathers were assembled in the principal church dedicated to Mary the Queen of Carmel, she, herself, appeared in their midst and spoke words of hope and courage and foretold to them, unwilling exiles, a glorious future for the order in lands beyond the seas. Not a few of the brethren elected to remain on in the east, though the only thing that seemed certain was death. Amongst them, we are told, was Simon. If he remained on Carmel after the close of the chapter, it was only for a brief period, and not at all for the length of time mentioned by some of his biographers. The necessity of his presence was too great, too urgent. In the West, because of the many monks who had gone there, because of the many foundations to be made there, because of the myriad difficulties sure to be encountered by those men who, unaccustomed to Western life, knew only of the calm and quiet of their beloved Carmel, Simon had already experienced the obstacles likely to beset the way of those newcomers. Already he had shown himself a man of action, though he never lost the relish for the life of the recluse. Already he had successfully treated with popes and princes and nobles. In the present state of affairs, Carmel in the West had need of a strong hand to guide its way to victory. This was found in Simon. In the first half of the decade of years that followed the migration of the Carmelites into Europe, their chief difficulties were to find hermitages that should serve as retreats wherein they could live according to the rule given them on Carmel. The clergy and the lay folk looked upon them as unwilling exiles from a distant land, and thus gave them all the pity and charity meted out to those in such misery. Then again they had sought retreats sufficiently removed from the centers of population, and even of ordinary traffic, and in this way there was no reason for the parochial clergy to bear them any jealousy, because of their influence with the people. Thus it was that, until Simon was elected to the generalship, he had to encounter only the problems that his good practical sense easily solved. The progress made by the brethren in England, added to the presence of the commissary general, pointed out that land is the place of the next general chapter, since all hope of continuing those meetings on the Holy Mount was out of the question because of the disturbed state of affairs in the East. An event now occurred to hasten the assembling of the fathers from the various parts of the world. The period of formation in regard to the communities that had recently passed into Europe was on the point of closing, and, under the guidance of Simon, a movement was soon to be initiated for extending the membership of the order, and consequently for facing the necessity of new foundations. This, the practical superior of the Western countries well knew, should entail opposition and much questionings. It was imperative, then, that the monks should be ready to produce their credentials. The news that was brought to them in their retreats, namely that the Holy Father was in France and had announced his intention of holding a general council of the Church in the year following, suggested to them immediate action. This information came to them in the later days of December of the year 1244, so that the council was to be summoned the middle of the year 1245. The presence of the Holy Father in France made approach to his person an easy matter. There was also the hope that the Ecumenical Council would declare the status of the order. The fathers who had the right to be summoned to the general chapter had received a hurried notice, but they all knew the reason for and recognized the necessity of the meeting. It was the first Western chapter, and its chief business was to elect a new general, for Alanus had intimated his intention not to undertake the office again, and, secondly, to nominate worthy fathers to represent the order at Lyons, where the first session of the General Council was to take place on June the 28th of the same year, and then last, though not least, it was the duty of the assembled brethren to formulate their petitions and to prepare all the information. Be presented to the Holy Father, innocent IV, and if necessary or advisable, to the General Council itself. The chapter was held at the monastery of Aylesford in Kent, then the largest and the most commodious in England. This convent had been built after the manner of the cells on Carmel, separate cells all opening out into a common quadrangle. The declared intention of Alanus not to seek re-election left only one preeminent candidate for the important office, so that the fathers unanimously voted for St. Simon. Then, and in the years immediately following, there were men in the order of great intellectual talents and of equally great administrative abilities, but Simon Stock stood alone in sanctity of life and business capacity combined. No other had done for Carmel what he had accomplished. No other was so fitted for the long and weary struggle to be endured by the monks of Carmel before they had reached the fame which they richly deserved in the 2 centuries that followed. The 2 fathers chosen to represent the order at Lyons were Reginald and Peter of Folsham. They brought with them the ancient rule and the papal approbation already given. They had their business transacted before the first session of the General Council took place, for the date attached to the Constitution of Innocent is the 6th day before the Ides of June. 2 other constitutions were granted to the Carmelites all before the first session of the General Council had been held. In the 3 constitutions given by Innocent IV, the Carmelites had all that then was necessary for their future progress. The Holy Father had confirmed the privileges given by his predecessor and had again given his own approbation to the rule of Honorius. Furthermore, he had taken the Carmelites under the protection of the Holy See and once more affirmed their privilege to celebrate Mass and to hold their offices even during the time of interdict, a very valuable privilege in such troublous times when constant conflicts with the Holy See were taking place in several of the countries of Europe. Finally, and this was a sign of the intention of the Carmelites to extend their order, not only was permission given them to seek alms, but an indulgence was given to those who were generous to them. There is not the shadow of doubt that all this forevision of the credentials to success came from the active practical mind of Simon. What has escaped the notice of the biographers of the saint, as well as the recent historians of the order, is the painful fact that from the election of Simon until the last of the Carmelite exiles passed to his eternal reward, there were 2 parties in the ranks of the Carmelites. One was formed of the men who had been on Carmel and who were ever dreaming of a return to the strict observance and the solitary life characteristic of the Holy Mount. Alanus had resigned his office because he could not reconcile the life in the West with his ideas already matured on Carmel. Years afterwards, the successor of Simon Stock renounced his generalship in high indignation because of the worldly life, as he considered it, amongst the new generation of Carmelites. The Igneous Sagitta of Nicholas the Gaul tells its own tale. There seemed ever to be in the minds of many of the Carmelites that Providence intended them to return once more to their cradle land. Even the terrible Mass Sacra of the monks in the last decade of the years of the 13th century did not dispel this pious belief. Indeed, we are not too certain that this same idea, in a more modified form, does not still live on in the minds of some of the more perfervid Carmelites. On the other hand, Simon, though his heart was still hankering after the tranquil hours spent in the tree cell in Kent and in the cave on Carmel, recognized the inevitable and made his plans so that those committed to his care should be equipped with all the means for doing God's holy will in their present circumstances. To break away from his old notions of solitary life and to face the mountainous difficult ties sure to be encountered in the new way of living required more than human courage. Hence we believe that Simon had the special guidance of the Queen of Carmel, to whom he was so devoted, and for the extending of whose devotion he was laboring. The combination of the contemplative and the active life was a dangerous experiment for a whole order instituted for the former alone, but in it, Simon detected a surer way to spread devotion to God's Mother. This was his hope and consolation, and the future years show how well founded was that hope and how genuine was that consolation. It is worthy of note that even Simon, profoundly interested as he must have been in Western affairs, turned his attention in his ending years to the beloved Carmel. In the year 1261, he obtains from the Holy Father a special indulgence for those visiting the Carmelite churches in the East, and, later still, the Patriarch of Jerusalem is exhorted by the Pope to remove the obstacles placed by the Bishop of Acon against the Carmelites having their church and cemetery with all their privileges in his diocese. The bishop is not to molest or allow the monks to be molested. One of his last petitions to the Holy See seems to have been to present a supplication to the Holy Father for an indulgence of 100 days to all the faithful who contribute to the new monastery and church to be built on Mount Carmel. Thus it was that his old love for Carmel and its silent caves had an awakening in the shadows of his coming end. From the year 1245, a new life was infused into the Carmelite order in Europe. It was no longer a question of seeking homes for the exiled monks from the East. There was the larger problem of development along lines which, while ensuring success, would create the least possible friction from the local clergy and from the new mendicant orders now in their prime. In the constitutions that came to the Carmelites from the papal court, it is evident that Simon had determined that the order in Europe should figure in the ecclesiastical world as a mendicant one, and that its internal government should be on the same lines as that of the Dominicans and Franciscans. In the year 1247, several consus scions were obtained from Rome that show the trend of the hoped for future progress. The order is commended to archbishops and bishops with the injunction that they were to receive the Carmelites benignly. The Holy Father, to ensure the realization of this precept, takes the order under his special protection, conceding to it those privileges in the time of interdict which other orders already have. To suit the altered state of affairs, to accommodate the rule to the new climate and the new manner of life, certain mitigations are given, although at the same time the rule already approved by Honorius is again approved and confirmed by the Holy Father, Innocent IV. During Simon's term of office, that is to say, until his death, it seems to have been his care to have each pope as soon as possible, after his election, approve the rule already existing and to confirm the same, in addition to Innocent IV. The other popes who granted this favor to Simon were Alexander IV, Urban IV, and Clement IV. The mitigation of the rule may have been a source of trouble to him, owing to the fervor of Carmel still animating many of the exiles who were certain to oppose any relaxation in their ancient mode of living. Simon, from his past experience, knew the necessity of having religious sufficiently learned to fulfill rightly all the duties of their state and life. Principal amongst those duties, since they had come to the West, was the instructing of the faithful, then also attention to the education of their own students. Consequently, he sent his younger religious to the university schools. At once we see breaking into the religious life of the Carmelites some of the evil customs then prevalent amongst young men gathered together from all parts of the world, and living the free life peculiar to the time. Even the young religious became involved in those faction squabbles. In 1254, we have the first application for permission to absolve his religious from the censure incurred by striking one already inscribed in the clerical state. Also, we observe that some of the students who were attending the universities must have been attracted to the order, and hence the necessity of having papal permission to absolve from censures those who wish to take the habit. The nearer approach to the mode of government of the mendicant orders is seen in the Constitution of Alexander, allowing the general and the provincials the right of visiting the monasteries, and also that of changing from place to place the members of the order, as well as the power of correcting them in a canonical manner. Novices are to be received in the same manner as with the mendicants. The Holy Father has also allowed the Carmelites to quest for their sustenance, and he exhorts the archbishops and the bishops not to molest them in the exercise of this privilege. As a co-relative to this, he requests the faithful to be generous to the religious when they are soliciting alms. In a word, Simon had now brought his order to the same level as the two important mendicant orders. The progress made by the Carmelites was as usual accompanied by the opposition of those who believed themselves injured by their privileges. Since the Carmelites were no longer confined to their cells, or rather to their monasteries, they were sure to come into collision with those who were already depending on the charity of the people. Very naturally, the local clergy were the principal sufferers, and it, consequently, came to pass that the archbishops and the bishops were forced to take sides on behalf of their own diocesan clergy. Hence, we see the often repeated admonition coming from the Holy See that the Carmelites were not to be molested in their rightful privileges. For the first 5 years of the generalship of Simon, this opposition grew stronger daily, until finally even the spirit of Simon was bowed down almost in despair. Thus it was that Simon found himself surrounded by a host of difficulties, both from within the order and from without. He had the strong opposition of those of the brethren who still opposed the mitigations and the attempts of the general to make the monks mendicant friars. Wherever the brethren had not a monastery fully built and equipped for the maintenance of the religious, then the fact that they had to seek alms brought them into contact with the ecclesiastical powers outside their temporary dwellings, and under whose jurisdiction they were, at least to a certain extent. In quite a number of places they had not begun to build the large monasteries that afterwards arose in those same neighborhoods. Then there was the difficulty of getting novices, the order having so little to attract the youth of the time. The peculiar religious dress of the Carmelites did not appeal to the Western ideas, neither did the mode of living of many of the monks, who, as we have already remarked, insisted on the Eastern observance, and had no intention of availing themselves of the papal mitigations. The movement for the change of the striped or barred cloak, as it was named, for the all-white mantle of the subsequent time had already begun, and with the sanction of Simon, but this was too serious a matter to accomplish successfully for the present. It was sure to be opposed by many of the brethren who had become attached to the cloak they had brought from Carmel. Then there was the opposition of those other orders whose religious dress was akin to the one proposed by the Reform. An event occurred in the year 1251, which was destined not only to solve the two great problems that then occupied the mind of Simon, but was destined to have a worldwide effect on the faithful. In that year, namely in 1251, Simon was visiting the new monastery situated at Newnham near Cambridge so that the students should be in fairly close touch with the university, which they were frequenting. It was in the generalship of Simon that the brethren had already moved from Chesterton to Newnham. They still retained the old mode of living, for we are told they made many cells, a church, a cloister, a dormitory, and the necessary office sufficiently constructed. It was in one of these very cells that Simon, now far advanced in years, was living, bent down under the weight of so many and so heavy burdens. Recognizing the futility of all mortal aid in the struggle, he had recourse to the one true friend of his life from the years when he held converse with her in the tree cell in Kent, until old age and trouble were overwhelming him. He prayed from evening fall until the dawn of the following day. He besought his Queen Mother to help the order to which she had given her name and to which she had called him from his rustic cell. If she were to refuse her help, then the last days for Carmel in the West had come. His ancient custom of saluting her in poetic numbers came back to him, and, from his anxious heart, he poured forth that hymn now so well known to every lover of the scapular flows Carmelite. Suddenly the little cell was illumined by a wondrous light, and lo, there appeared to him the Mother of God surrounded by hosts of angels. She held in her hand a scapular, and giving it to the astounded Simon, she said, "This is a sign to you and to all Carmelites that whoever dies wearing this scapular shall never see eternal fire." She then disappeared, leaving the aged general full of consolation and courage. As inspired by the Blessed Virgin in the vision, Simon sent 2 of the fathers to the Pope, who, having heard the story of the messengers, issued a constitution in January 1252, exhorting the prelates everywhere to treat charitably and benignly the Carmelites, and, if the ecclesiastics still persisted in molesting them, they were to be proceeded against by ecclesiastical censures. In September of the year of the vision, the Holy Father had taken the order, and all belonging to it under the protection of the Holy See. But that did not seem enough, so he then proceeded to strike at the root of the miserable conditions in which the Carmelites found themselves. Before the September of 1254, we have no less than 4 other papal constitutions in favor of the Carmelites. There was no longer reason to doubt the efficacy of the intercession of God's Mother. Then occurred to Simon the idea that the time had come for a change in the principal religious habit of the Carmelites in the West. Not at once, but in the near future, the obstacle that made many of the Western youth fight shy of the Carmelite order should be removed, that is to say, the barred mantle. He argued rightly that, in the course of time, the scapular would be recognized by all as the habit of the order. Hence, the mantle should then fall into a secondary place in the importance of the friars and the faithful generally. As a matter of fact, 20 years after Simon was laid in his tomb, the fathers in a general chapter declared the putting aside of the striped or barred mantle, because they said the scapular was the habit of the friars. Amongst the faithful, the well-being of the Carmelite order had become, for many of them, a really personal affair by reason of the confraternity formed by Simon and his brethren to foster the devotion of the scapular. When the people learned of the promise given by the Blessed Virgin to all who wore the habit given to Simon, all those who knew the Carmelites, and the SBCIs who lived near to their monasteries or hermitages, eagerly desired to wear it. In this way, a body of men and women arose who were bound together in a kind of religious fraternity under the guidance of one of the friars. It is very reasonable to expect that such associations partook of the nature of the guilds then so well known. Hence, we find in their records accounts of works of mercy and of charity obligatory on the members, but the real bond of union was the scapular, just as the full habit was in the case of the friar. Many of the nobles wore the scapular and consequently were members of the confraternity. In the university centers, the students and the professors seem to have been active members of those religious associations. It was from the meetings of those members that the idea, if not the necessity, of a special feast day arose, for they had their special chapels in the churches, as well as having their special meeting places. The influence of many wearers of the scapular, whose names are well known to us from old records, was very great as well in civil life as also in ecclesiastical, so that the next step, namely to the right to celebrate a special feast for the members, was an easy one. This was the real origin of the feast known to us today as the solemn commemoration of Our Blessed Lady of Mount Carmel. We need not say that in the beginning its appearance was rather humble as became the association, but gradually it spread and became more and more popular. It is quite evident that the feast was first celebrated in England, whence it gradually spread over the other Carmelite provinces until in the years following, it became a feast of the universal church, as it is today. From the year 1251, the fortunes of the Carmelites improved very much, and although all obstacles did not disappear, nevertheless they received an impetus that ceased not for 300 years. During the decade following the scapular vision, Simon was engaged in the work of securing the older foundations and preparing a new generation of Carmelites. It was in those years that the Carmelites were given the places wherein they, in a few years afterwards, were able to raise up the large and commodious monasteries of which we have some of the historical records and which remained in all their vigor and strength until the Reformation times, when they were totally destroyed or pillaged and given over to seculars. The 5 or 6 years that passed after the giving of the scapular were the most important years in the life of the saint, for it was then that he laid the foundations for the success so soon to crown his labors, not only in England but in all the provinces. Because of the prestige given by the confraternity in its earliest days, England became the most important province in the whole order, and so it remained for a long period of time. In fact, its prestige was challenged by Sicily alone, where the confraternity, or as it was called there, from the beginning La Campagna, had spread from one part of the island to the other, until it became universal. In 1254, Simon had to turn his attention to some new foundations in France. The pious King Louis had brought from Carmel 6 Carmelites to introduce the order into Paris. In a short time, the Carmelites were to be found in many parts of France, and finally became not only numerous but very flourishing and influential in civil and religious life. Every 3 years the general chapter was held, at which assisted the principal men of the order, namely, the provincials and their companions. On almost every occasion Simon was present at these conventions. In this way he was in constant touch with the whole order in Europe, which even in his days had extended to Ireland and Scotland and Spain, as well as shaping many new foundations in countries like Germany, France, and Italy. At the general chapter held in London, Simon lost one of his most active and reliable helpers in the reform then going on, namely Ralph Fresburn, who had come from Carmel with him and had participated in all the early movements of the order in England. Now old age had come upon him, hence he resigned his office of provincial for England. Providence, however, reserved a good successor for the important office, so the fathers elected Henry Hanna, a man of great administrative ability and gifted with many fine intellectual qualities. Under him the progress of the English province was almost phenomenal, and to him, as much as to Simon, was due the educational opportunities inaugurated for the students in England. Shortly after his election to the provincialate, he founded a house for the Carmelites in Stockwell, a village in the confines of Oxford. Humphrey Necton was the first doctor in theology of this university. But he was only the first of a long line of learned Arnan who were a credit to the university as well as to the order. In the same year, 1259, Peter Swanington also obtained his master's degree in theology. He had been the companion and secretary of St. Simon, although evidently much his junior in years. Simon himself is said to have received the same degree, but only out of insistence on the part of the university faculty, who knew of his wonderful ability and his activities for his order. There appears no doubt that he had gained his degree of Bachelor of Divinity as early as 1244, but in the University of Cambridge. The Carmelites had even at this early period good schools of both philosophy and theology for their young students. This intellectual assiduity was clue to Simon, who, however, had another splendid helper in the youthful Swanington Hanna also. Although he does not seem to have been a preacher for the people, was wont to give the students lectures which were of wonderful literary value. Not alone in England did this love of learning seize on the Carmelites, but it became the common characteristic of the order in France, and Germany, and Italy, especially during the succeeding years. There are 2 papal constitutions that make apparent to us the progress that Simon's idea had made as to the combination of the active and the contemplative life in the order. First, in 1256, Primus Son is given to administer the sacraments to all persons in any way connected with the monasteries, or the hermitages then, in 1262. To this permission is added the more important one of administering the sacraments to the faithful outside the monasteries. In this way the Carmelites were almost in daily intercourse with the faithful who were seeking their spiritual administrations. A privilege that appears to be a result of the confraternity's influence is twice granted by papal constitution, namely the burial of secular people in the graveyards of the religious, or rather in the church precincts. We can see in this new legislation the idea of Simon realized. The active life has placed the Carmelites in closer relations with the faithful, and they are not entirely confined to the contemplative life. Not only in the sacred science of theology did the Carmelites become proficient, but in other branches of learning. We have William of Sandwich, whose history is our only information on many matters of vital importance to the order. Then, too, there was Peter Argentorensis, as he was called from his native city in Germany, an historian in addition to his other accomplishments. Simon himself was a poet of no mean order, and the sacred hymns, which he has left us, bespeak the sweetness and facility of a master's mind. The chief works usually attributed to the saint are the canons of divine worship homilies, for the people of which we have already spoken, a treatise on Christian penance letters to the brethren, hymns in honor of the Blessed Virgin. The best known of these being Flos Carmelite and the Ave Stella Matutina, except for the time he spent in his cell at Carmel. His religious life was too full of active work to dedicate much of it to literature. And any hours he could steal from the cares of his office he devoted them to contemplation and prayer, in order that he might renew and perfect, as far as was possible under the circumstances, the life he began in the rustic cell in Kent. The declining years of Simon knew no rest. He traveled unceasingly from place to place, ever encouraging the brethren in their new life, whilst exhorting them not to forget the contemplative life which was distinctive of their origin and of the place whence the order came. It was in the 100th year of his age that he set out for the general chapter to be held in France in the monastery of Toulouse. With his companions he arrived in Bordeaux, but it was destined by Providence that he was never to leave it alive. Falling sick, he died surrounded by his brethren from all parts of the Carmelite world. They were on their way to the general chapter, and had been attracted to Bordeaux by the news of the serious illness of their general. On the 16th of May, in the year 1265, Simon Stock rendered his pure soul to his Creator and to Mary, Queen of Carmel. One can easily imagine the intense sorrow not only of the fathers assembled in Bordeaux, but of all Carmelites, for all had seen the wonderful works of their general, and were witnesses to the progress the order had made under his benign but effective rule. To intensify still more their grief, it must have occurred to them that the finding of a fitting successor to Simon was a difficult task, if not an impossibility. It is meet that we narrate here the story told by his biographers about his body when laid in the tomb. Immediately after the body of Simon was laid to rest and the tomb was closed, a beautiful perfume exuded from the coffin wherein the body was reposing and remained around the burial place. More remarkable still, the darkness of the place was put to flight by a very brilliant light which continued to shine until the brethren, in great consternation, summoned the Archbishop of Bordeaux. This prelate was a man of great sanctity, and had known Simon and the wonderful work he had done for the Blessed Virgin. Hence, nothing doubting, he ordered the brethren to remove the stone that covered the tomb, and lo, the odor became stronger and stronger, and the frame of the dead general seemed alive with a golden light. Age and a life of penance had reduced the body of Simon to the proportions of a skeleton, but now those very bones almost protruding from the skin were the bearers of the wondrous illumination. Reverently the body was again enclosed in its tomb by the holy prelate, and then, at that very time, and for centuries afterwards, wondrous works were witnessed at the tomb of Simon. The brethren ever venerated him as a saint, and so did the people of Bordeaux. His relics were very much treasured and very much sought for by all the churches of the order. Many extraordinary stories are recorded about their efficacy. It would be tedious to enumerate the well-attested narratives told about the powerful intercession of Simon with the good God, whose delight is to show the spiritual greatness of those who have served him faithfully in life. Twice was the cause of the servant of God introduced before the Holy See, but the process had taken such time that it was seemingly forgotten after each attempt. The Holy Father Nicholas III conceded to the church in Bordeaux the Mass and the office of a confessor to commemorate the day on which St. Simon Stock passed from earth to heaven. In the calendar of the Carmelites, every 16th of May is dedicated to the feast of St. Simon Stock as a major double office of the second-class duplex Massachusetts Diocese, the lessons being proper. All Carmelites, as well as all wearers of the scapular, can gain a plenary indulgence, on the usual conditions, by observing the feast in the prescribed manner. Under an altar of precious marble, in one of the beautiful chapels of the great Cathedral of Bordeaux, lies the body of St. Simon Stock, to whom our Blessed Lady gifted the scapular. Time was when rever order. Many extraordinary stories are recorded about their efficacy. It would be tedious to enumerate the well-attested narratives told about the powerful intercession of Simon with the good God, whose delight is to show the spiritual greatness of those who have served him faithfully in life. Twice was the cause of the servant of God introduced before the Holy See, but the process had taken such time that it was seemingly forgotten after each attempt. the Holy Father Nicholas III conceded to the church in Bordeaux the Mass and the office of a confessor to commemorate the day on which Saint Simon Stock passed from earth to heaven. In the calendar of the Carmelites, every 16th of May is dedicated to the feast of Saint Simon Stock as a major double office of the second-class duplex Massachusetts Just SC, the lessons being proper. All Carmelites as well as all wearers of the scapular can gain a plenary indulgence, on the usual conditions, by observing the feast in the prescribed manner. Under an altar of precious marble, in one of the beautiful chapels of the great Cathedral of Bordeaux, lies the body of Saint Simon Stock, to whom our Blessed Lady gifted the scapular. Time was when reverent pilgrims came from all parts of the world to ask the intercession of the saint. Today only scanty numbers approach the shrine, for the wonderful life of Simon Stock is not now so well known. France, a land fertile in saints, is loyally attending to those of her own children, who have been raised to the altars of the church. After all, Simon is but a stranger in a strange land and, doubtless, with a heavenly charity, looks kindly on the national fidelity that prefers devotion to the native born than to he's stranger from afar. The Carmelites have reason to thank the generous providence that ordained the death and burial of Simon in the convent at Bordeaux. Had he been laid to rest in the land of his birth, his mortal remains would have been hidden in some secret place to escape the devastating hand of the ignorant fanatics amongst the reformers. With the destruction of the churches of his order, and with the disappearance of the religious, the memory of Simon and of his wondrous life should have passed into a kind of oblivion. It is quite true that, so long as the scapular is worn and so long as there is a faithful soul attached to Our Lady of Carmel, the name of Simon Stock cannot be obliterated from the minds of the people of the Church. Pious writers love to tell us that Saint Joseph was so long a forgotten saint because of his relationship in life with the Son of God and the Blessed Virgin. This, indeed, was a blessed oblivion. But a time came when God would reveal the sanctity and the utility of the life of the foster father of Jesus. Then it was that the faithful came to know Joseph and to beg his intercession, and greater then was his glory and more profound the knowledge of him. In a lesser way, by all means, yet the similitude is instructive. Has the life of Simon been overshadowed by the magnitude of the gift of God's mother to the faithful children of the Church? So many wear the scapular and appreciate its wonderful spiritual advantages, but rarely do they seek to know the life of him to whom the Mother of God gave it. We may not doubt that this is just as Simon would have it. The life that he so freely gave to her devotion from time he entered his tree cell glow and more profound the knowledge of him. In a lesser way, by all means, yet the similitude is instructive. Has the life of Simon been overshadowed by the Magni in Kent until he passed to hitude of the gift of God's mother to the reward in faithful children of the Church? So many wear the scapular and appreciate its wonderful spiritual advantages, but rarely do they seek to know the life of him to whom the do that this is just as Simon would have it. Vote in Kent until he passed to his reward in Bordeaux is made more precious reposing in the shadow of his heavenly mother's gift to him, and all Carmelites the scapular. Bordeaux is made more precious reposing in the shadow of his heavenly mother's gift to him, and all Carmelites the scapular.